Nombre sobre todo nombre, reinarás por siempre, siempre igual, exáltale.
Hello, my name is Michelle Ferrigno-Warren. I work for the Christian Community Development Association, and I'm their Advocacy Director. I've had the opportunity to work with CCDA as the Advocacy Director for the past 7 years. And I am also excited to be able to talk a little bit about political advocacy for this shared project with Matthew 25, with Fuller, Sojourners, and CCDA. I have the opportunity to teach a political advocacy class for Denver Seminary in their Justice and Missions program. And it takes a whole semester to begin to build the framework for political advocacy, for campaigns, and all of the different things that you want to do to bring your personal convictions and your personal stories and your needs to the public sector and to the public square. Unfortunately, we only have 10 minutes. So what I've tried to do is give a really broad overview of what you will be doing when you are thinking about what you want to represent. So as I said, advocacy or political advocacy is really taking your personal convictions to a public place. For us as Christians, we're very comfortable within the walls of the church. We understand all of those different dynamics. We know how to express ourselves, and that's a very comfortable setting. And so often it's really intimidating to think that you would go outside the church with your personal convictions to really share about what you're seeing and pressing needs around immigration. But it's really important because there's no church and there's no nonprofit that really can work to address the systemic injustice around immigration. It requires a legislative response. And so if you're going to make a legislative response, you need to go to the powers that are able to make that change. And so that's really the idea of the 10 minutes of the course, just a real snapshot on how you can represent yourself, represent your issue, represent your neighbors, whatever it is that you need to public sector or to legislators or to people who run city, state, or federal government to advocate on behalf of immigrants and immigration for your community. The very first thing that you want to look at is, what is the problem? That seems really basic, but the reality is that often our problems are so big, it's hard to define that. So we're going to take time to talk about what the problem is and how to answer that question. The second thing is, who can help us address it? If you've got a problem and you're going to the wrong person, they won't be able to help you. And that's really frustrating. It's frustrating for you. It's frustrating for the person who's listening. So how can we get to the right person or the right level of government to address the issue that we're seeing as a problem? And then finally, it's how are we going to make it happen? It's just a really basic question. We need to put together strategies. How are we going to be convincing? How are we going to lay out what we need in such a way that will be able to be heard and that action will be taken on it? So let's go ahead and go to that very first question. The first question is, what is the problem? People in power who have the ability to change a problem need to know what your clearly defined issue is. So often we come with stories which are really, really important to help explain the problem. Sometimes we have just too much information. And so it's really a good exercise for us to really figure out, how is our issue clearly defined? Before we can begin the process of advocacy, we need to clearly define and understand the problem that we're seeing. So the first question to help us define the problem is, what do you want to see changed? Sometimes my friend Alexia Salvatierra, when she talks about organizing, she'll phrase it as, what is your hope? And this could be really big things that you want to see changed. I want comprehensive immigration reform. Maybe it's something like, I want the 3- and 10-year bar that has been put on people who have been in the country without status, who have to return to their country of origin to further their process. I want that bar to be lifted. Maybe it's something, at a different type of level, which is, I remember working with a group of pastors in Nebraska not that many years ago, where the city council put together a policy that said, if you're undocumented, you can't rent from even private apartment complexes or houses. And so the problem was that people couldn't have access to good housing. So you need to really think about, what do you want to see changed? What is the goal or the outcome that you're looking to accomplish? What is the result that you want? Another thing when you're looking at the actual problem is, who does it impact? So I mentioned just this whole idea of rent. It didn't seem fair to these people who were living in Nebraska that the city council could put this ordinance together that said, you know what, we're going to check people's legal status that so we can find out if we should be able to rent to them. It seemed completely obviously unfair. You didn't have access to housing, but it was even more of a problem when you began to look at who it's going to impact. What about families that had maybe an undocumented parent and a documented parent? What about the kids who are US citizens? Those are really important elements of who it impacts, because when you're talking to political officials and in the public square, people who are US citizens have different opportunities and rights than people who have green cards, than people who all the way go down to visas, and then people who have undocumented status. And the more you're able to share who it impacts, especially the demographic, you know, you want to say, how is it impacting children? How is it impacting their learning? How is it impacting families and how they're able to function in flourishing? How is mental health impacted? So those are good questions to be asking. Who does it impact? Another thing is that when you say something like, you know, I really want to see dreamers have an opportunity to be able to have a path to legal status or citizenship. So dreamers, for many of you probably know, but for those of you who might not know, dreamers is that category of young people who are brought here from another country, that they've been educated in our public school system or just in our education system here in the United States. They've grown up in America. They consider themselves Americans, but because with you, when you don't have status in the United States, you're not able to move forward with any type of path to legality or citizenship. How can we help kids who have grown up, who have their whole life ahead of them, who, you know, call the United States their home? How can we move that, you know, group of people forward? When you ask the question, of course, who's it going to impact? Well, it's going to impact, you know, the students. It's going to impact their families. Some dreamers, you know, have children of their own, have homes of their own, have businesses on their own. And so you might be talking through all the different economic as well as personal benefits to people being able to have status. But when you're asking that last question is, how can I make it relatable? People that you're talking to in the public square are literally just people. They're human beings who love to hear things through story, just like you and I. And the more we can relate what is happening, the problems that we're seeing, the big, scary issues, you know, that we want to address, the more that we can make it a very personal story. A story of now it's not just a dreamer, but it's Jonathan. And Jonathan and his wife Jasmine, who have now been out of, you know, high school for over 15 years, and they're married, and that they've got US citizen kids. And, you know, we'll talk a little bit more on strategies as far as making things relatable, but it's really important for us to be able to share our problem in a way that is relatable to the person that we're talking to. That's actually just good communication, but it's also smart strategy in political advocacy. So the next question in, you know, what is the problem is, what do you want to see changed? It's so easy to bring all of your problems to the table because there's such a strong sense of urgency, because they impact people that we care about. They impact our community. But it's really important, and it's very strategically important, to narrow your issue as much as possible. So maybe you don't want to walk in and say, oh, I care about comprehensive immigration reform, and let's talk about all of those tenets. But it may be, you know, I am married, I'm a US citizen, and I'm married to somebody who's undocumented. And while there's a lot of problems with immigration, I want to talk about my story and my situation, and I want to see what I can do to petition for my husband to, you know, get around the 3 or 10-year bars, or whatever that story is. You want to narrow it down as much as possible, because the bigger something is, the harder it is for you to talk about it and communicate it about it. And of course, it's harder to address it and solve as well for the person who's listening. You want to ask yourself, what's the goal or the outcome you are looking to accomplish? Just like narrowing your conversation, you want to make sure that that goal is tangible and very specific. I just gave you an illustration of a US citizen woman maybe petitioning for her undocumented husband. That is definitely something that is very narrow. It speaks to a bigger overall picture, but it's very tangible and it's very specific. The more specific you can get to your situation and to the way you're seeing it, the more you can build out of there as far as a bigger problem. Obviously, the example that I'm giving, there's not just one person who's a US citizen who is trying to petition for their undocumented spouse. This is a chronic problem, and it speaks to the bigger issue. But when you're really trying to address things with people who have the power to make change, you want to make it specific and narrow and tangible. You need to understand what exactly you identify as the problem so you can offer a solution. And this is really important. You can always offer a solution. Sometimes when we throw our problems at people just in life, it's really good to have people listen, but you share them, and sometimes people want to know a little bit more. Well, what do you think the solution to this problem is? And people who are in public office are no different. And that needs to be a part of what you are ready to talk about when you're defining the problem. What do you see as the solution? I always tell people, you may really be convinced of your side of the argument. I know I'm convinced of my side of the argument, but I'm only as strong as understanding the opposition. And so it's really important, and I'll use the DACA students. I feel very passionate, and you may share that passion with me, that they should have an opportunity to move their status forward. But it's really important for me to really listen and understand the argument of why DACA students shouldn't have the opportunity to move forward. When I consider the angle of the opposition, it makes me stronger in understanding how I want to petition and speak into addressing a problem. It's really important because the legislators probably heard both sides too. And what I have found from my experience is when you give your side, it doesn't take too long for them to present the argument that has been presented to them as well. Even as much as they want to fix the problem, they have been hearing both sides, and you need to make sure that you've educated yourself on both sides so that you will be able to make your point stronger and really understand, so that when somebody comes back and says, well, I've heard this opposing argument to why Dreamers shouldn't have a path forward, you can say, I've heard that too, but this is what I think. And it really helps you identify that you're very well versed in the problem and what needs to be addressed, as well as how you are the person who should be there to help offer solutions as well. What you want to do is also look at who it impacts. When I say look at who it impacts, is you want to look at the timeline of the impact and not just the immediate situation. You want to learn about the specific impact in broader situations. You want to humanize the situation, just like I shared before. Make it as contextual and personal as possible. You want to share personal stories of how it's impacting. I want to tell you about Jonathan and Jasmine and how I met them and how they got married and how they started their own business and how they have their own house and just how great of a contributor they are to our communities. And I want to share why I care and where I'm personally involved. And that is something that is incredibly important for everybody, is you want to share why. You're not just some independent lobbyist who is, on the bankroll of somebody and you're representing the company's opinion. You're a person in the community. You've come to this situation because of very personal relationships, sometimes from your own situation, and you want to share why it impacts you personally, because it really helps make that connection to why people should listen to you. The next question is, who can help us address this? The US government is big, and we have what's called a federalist system. So there's just many different layers to the federal government. In my PowerPoint, I specifically share just the different elements of the federal, state, and local governments. And it's important to know that, because when I was talking to you about the rent issue in Nebraska, well, often immigration, who can regulate who can come in and out of the country, is at the federal level. Who can rent is at the city council level. It's at the local level. And so me meeting with my US senator isn't going to help address the limitations around that rent situation. DACA, I mentioned DACA as far as Dreamers. Unfortunately, state level and local level can't help with making somebody legal. But from my own personal experience, when I was working in the Colorado State Legislature back many years ago, we were working to help DACA students be able to have, or Dreamers students be able to have access to in-state tuition. That's something that was at the state level. And so we could really meet with our state General Assembly and then eventually our governor to try to make sure that in-state tuition benefits that helped other students and US citizens here in the state of Colorado, that other students who were undocumented that were Dreamers would also be able to have access to in-state tuition, since Colorado has been their home. Like I mentioned, at the federal government is really the biggest branch of the government that regulates immigration. They're the ones who not only regulate who can come in and come out through Department of Homeland Security, but also work with visas and legal status and all of those different things that would enable people who are undocumented to have the opportunity to stay and to flourish. And so I would just encourage you, when you're looking at your problem, you're looking at trying to define it and make it tangible, that you really look and see who can help us. There's so much to be said about that, but once again, I only have such a short period of time, but want you to understand that there are different levels of government, and you need to address the problem that you see to the appropriate level of government. The final piece is, how do we make it happen? This is just basic strategy. How do we want to communicate all of this information? We've now figured out who it is we're going to talk to. We know what our arguments are. We know, the opposing view. We know our view. We've got, all of our personalized stories and information, and we are ready. I think it's really important to know that the government is not like the private sector. It's not like the nonprofit sector. They actually represent the people, and that they are there for the public good. And so you can call any branch of government at any time and ask for a meeting. So many people don't even realize that. They think it's a privilege that, that you have to kind of earn. And it is a privilege in our country to be able to meet with elected officials. But as somebody, especially as a US citizen, or people who are living in our country, with certain rights and privileges, that's having access to elected officials is one of those opportunities. You can hold private meetings with government agencies, with people, with organizations, and with good legal standing. There are definitely some people who would say, oh, I brought undocumented people to meetings, and I would just offer that caution. I usually recommend that you don't bring undocumented people to meetings with elected officials, because one, you often have to record personal information. When you meet with legislators, you often are asked what your address is. They want to see if they're their constituent, and giving that kind of personal information is probably not the best idea for an undocumented person. And then for the person who is the elected official, it puts them in an uncomfortable place. And so I just recommend that. I know there are other people who may disagree, but I recommend that, in your meeting, that you bring people who are in good legal standing. Again, you want to share your problem at the meeting. You want to develop your talking points. This is not something that you just walk in and do. This is a really great privilege and opportunity, and you want to make it as tight of a message as possible. You want to make it personal. You want to make it human. And one of the ways that you can do that is, I've encouraged people to bring pictures of people that you're talking about. There's plenty of undocumented people that I just didn't feel like it was a good idea to bring, but I wanted to bring them with me. So I brought family pictures. I brought certificates, trophies their kids had won, and all of these different things that said, this person, this two-dimensional picture is this three-dimensional person in our world and in our community that's contributing really greatly. So anything that can be personalized, that can help represent that person. Another thing is letters of community support. Could be petition letters. This could just be letters from teachers or pastors, just so that others would say, I'm not the only person talking about this issue and talking about this particular person that's impacted by the issue, but there's a whole community that has either signed this petition or has sent letters of support. You want to be able to show that this person is not just, hiding under a rock, but that they're in the community, and the community would be even stronger if they had opportunities afforded for them. Finally, you want to make sure that you're on time and that you're respectful, because this meeting shouldn't just be the first and last meeting. What this meeting is it's building a relationship to the person who has the legislative power to make change. It's important for you to be in relationship with them, not just for this one issue, but just in general. That's exactly how government's supposed to work. Government represents the people, and they have to know the people. And so you want to make sure that you are always building bridges to elected officials and that you're not burning them. I know that there's hardships. I know that there's tension, but there's always another opportunity to continue to build towards something that will really promote the flourishing and well-being of your community and individuals within your community. And finally, I would say that you want to make sure, especially as a person of faith, that you exemplify love and grace that Christ exemplifies. Another thing that I often do is I will ask the legislator if I can close the meeting in prayer. Some people do it at the front end. Maybe we may start the meeting in prayer. What I want to make sure is that you don't feel like you have to check your faith at the door. Be the pastor, be the faith leader that you are, and invite people in power into that expression of faith through prayer. I hope you found this helpful and that you'll find the other resources for the class helpful, and that you will have the courage and the boldness and the words as you begin to bring your personal convictions to a public place.